So I introduced to you last week this idea of a lamentation that is an expression of grief and mourning, often in poetic form. We are, over these next few Sundays, we are going to hear lamentations of Jesus, cries of mourning and sorrow that reflect a broken heart as he looks upon the world around him, and as he makes a very honest appraisal of what he sees within the society of his time. And so we turn now to the gospel according to Matthew. Let us hear the word of our God. And then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." I think you're all familiar with the law of gravity. A very simple idea, really. What goes up must come down. If you throw a ball into the air, you know that it will return to the earth. Now, about 400 years ago, this idea of the law of gravity was discerned in a very wonderful way by the scientist Isaac Newton. It is said that in the year 1666, when he was seated in his garden, he had a wonderful apple tree in his garden, and as the legend goes, he was sitting beneath the apple tree, and an apple fell from the branch on his head, and he had one of those aha moments, a eureka moment, in which he discovered that things do fall down, and that there is this particular law. Now, that's kind of the legend. It's really believed more that he was sitting in his garden and he saw an apple fall from a tree. Regardless, though, whether it landed on his head or whether he simply saw it fall, Isaac Newton came to understand that there is this force that returns things back to the earth. I think I would suggest to you this morning is that what Jesus is teaching here is that the spiritual life is really governed by the law of gravity. What goes up must come down. Now, he makes this law of gravity very explicit as he describes the religious leaders around him. They like to elevate themselves. They go out in public and they have great demonstrations of their spiritual standing, their spiritual abilities. They wear the particular devotional clothing that marks them as religious leaders. They desire to be called rabbi. They desire to be known as scholars and teachers. They desire to lift themselves up, as Jesus says. They place the burden of the law on the shoulders of those around them, pushing others down with the burden of the law as they enjoy the fruits of exaltation. But Jesus makes a counterclaim. And this is where the law of gravity comes into effect. And this is why I think we might discern or describe the spiritual life in its authenticity as that which obeys the law of gravity. Because Jesus turns everything upside down. He says, those who have exalted themselves, exalt those who have lifted themselves up, those who have put themselves high above all of the others within the community with their titles and clothing and public displays of spiritual knowledge. Those who exalt themselves like the apple in Newton's tree are going to come down. Just as you throw a ball into the air, it will certainly land upon the earth. So Jesus says, those who are exalted, they will be humbled. They will be humbled. It's a very different way, radically different way of thinking about the spiritual life and just thinking about human life in general. Humility, Jesus describes here, is really what exaltation looks like. Those who are humble, they will be lifted up. They will be lifted up not to lord themselves over others, and here's the big distinction. They will be lifted up as examples of the manner in which to live their lives. Those who exalt themselves, they will come crashing down. But those who are humble, they will be lifted up by the sheer manner of their living. They will embody the authentic core of the spiritual life. For people of faith, when we practice the distinctives of our faith in our lives, when we embark upon the spiritual life, it's often thought that we need to prove ourselves. We need to make great demonstrations of our faith. We need to be able to show the world that we are different, that we are better, that we are higher, that we know more than the people around us. It's so easy to desire exaltation. There is something within us, sadly, this kind of motor within us that propels us to want to lift ourselves up. And maybe it's because it is the way in which our society operates. It caters to that human desire to be bigger and to be better. Perhaps I think a long time ago I shared with you a very pithy phrase from one of the great theologians of the 20th century, Karl Barth, a Swiss theologian. Barth, when asked about humankind and the plight of humankind, he said very simply, but very profoundly, the root of all sin is the desire to be the boss. How interesting that is. And it really says something I think that we can relate to. We're kind of pressured to be better. There's pressure upon us to lift ourselves up. Sometimes that drive, of course, it is within us. We have to contend with it, but we also have to contend with forces around us. There is this movement within the world that exaltation is what really counts. That becoming powerful and strong is not only a demonstration of great spiritual advancement, but it is simply a great demonstration of humanity at its very best. However, what Jesus sees around him is that exaltation and this egotistical pride go hand in hand, but there is something else that happens when we exalt ourselves. And Jesus diagnoses that issue very, very clearly here. We tend to exalt ourselves upon the backs of others. That's what Jesus sees here. The great religious leaders that he argues with, he sees that they have lifted themselves up by placing burdens upon others. They raise themselves up as they stand on the backs of the people around them. They do that often with the demands of the law. Sometimes they do that by calling other people sinners and imagining themselves righteous. Exaltation, this drive to exalt oneself, it operates not in a vacuum, but it operates at the expense of other people. And so Jesus makes very clear that the law of gravity applies to communities, that the law of gravity applies to people of faith. If we want to go up, we're going to come down. We're going to fall down. That's just the way it is. Like an apple falling from a tree, like a ball that is tossed in the air. And so in the Lenten season, it's good for us. It's good for us to remember this law of gravity in the spiritual life. It's good for us to understand that when we go up, we're going to come down. But you know, there's something very powerful and very liberating when we understand this, because it frees us from that compulsion to be bigger and to be better. It frees us from that compulsion to be powerful, to demonstrate to others just how great, how spiritually advanced we are. There is freedom in recognizing the law of gravity applies to us. There is tremendous freedom in that. Of course, it's a challenge. Humility is always a challenge, but ultimately, we are set free. We are set free. It's within our spiritual lives, it's within the individual, but it's also within the church as well. I think about how churches are often evaluated upon how big they are, upon how many members fill the sanctuary. We see what they call megachurches across our nation, and megachurches are often held up as this example. That's what we need to aspire to be. But you know, I believe there is something really beautiful in a smaller congregation. I really believe that within a smaller congregation, we learn a certain humility. We learn a certain humility, but we come to know each other so well and so deeply. We come to experience a fellowship that is really very profound, because within a smaller community, we see that we are sister and brother. We see so clearly that our lives are intertwined. We are not pursuing that kind of exaltation, but we are living humbly, and that's beautiful. It's a challenge, no doubt. We are faced with many difficulties, no doubt. But there is something particularly wonderful and beautiful. I heard a pastor from a rural America who talked about this. He talked about how his congregation was in a very small town, and so of course it was a very small congregation. But the people there discovered that in this humble setting, there was something powerful and there was something beautiful. That in that humble setting, they discovered that their lives were truly intertwined, and that their witness in their community was humble, but it was strong. It was humble, but it was dynamic. It was humble, but it was full of vitality. I think we can relate to that. I think we can. And I think there is great integrity in that. When we recognize that this is who we are, this is where we stand, this is our life together. And so this law of gravity, it applies to us as individuals within our spiritual lives. The law of gravity reminds us that we will walk upon the earth, that we are rooted here, that any attempt to make ourselves bigger and better will fail, of course, but it's a reminder for the church as a whole to walk upon the earth, in that particularly humble yet dynamic way. It's a clear contrast that Jesus sets forth as he looks at his society, as he looks at the community around him, and he sees those who are so puffed up. He sees those who really elevate themselves. And this is a cause for lamentation. Of course, Jesus is upset when he sees this, but it's also a lamentation. We have to understand, like I've said before, that Jesus is not really simply an angry man, but he's a man with a heart that is tender and a heart that breaks when he sees these kinds of dynamics around him. And it's a lamentation when he says, if you exalt yourselves, you're going to fall down. It's a powerful teaching, but it comes from a heart that breaks when this kind of dynamic is revealed. And so here we are hearing this saving word that we don't need to prove ourselves, but rather we walk humbly upon this earth. We walk humbly upon this earth, understanding that there is freedom in our humility. Understanding that the law of gravity is not oppressive, but rather the law of gravity, it sets us free because we are reminded God doesn't call us to fly through the skies above everyone else. But God calls us to walk gently upon this earth, shaped by the words of Jesus, formed by the life of the Spirit that he imparts to us, and understanding clearly that our lives are intertwined, that our lives have been made one through this one who says, I am your teacher. I am the Messiah. I am this one. And I gather you unto me. Amen.